All right, welcome back to the last ever class you'll enjoy until I teach again. It's just a sad moment for you, but exciting for me. We're finishing up as we talked about on Wednesday with the Mosaic Law during the time of Jesus, and really just focusing on how Jesus relates to the law, what he does to the old law throughout his ministry. So we'll kind of pick it up from there after Todd leads us in prayer.
Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for all the blessings we have. We're thankful for the time we have to be together here and study your word and learn from it together in peace. We're thankful that you love us and that you show us grace and mercy. And we're thankful more than anything for your Son, Jesus Christ. We're thankful for his sacrifice. We ask that you would help us to live lives of service, that we would be like him in all the ways we can. We pray this in his name. Amen.
Thank you. So we finished up last time looking at Jesus' relationship to the law and kind of, as I said, how he interacts with what his kind of position is. The first and obvious one, right, he's the fulfillment of the law. He is the prophesied Messiah, right, all those things. And we also talked about how he reinterpreted the law and kind of, right, the old law we think of, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery. But on the Sermon on the Mount, there was debate on what reinterpreting means. So take it however you want, right? He just kind of spelled it out a little bit more, right? Murder isn't just the actual action of ending someone's life, right? It is the thought, it's the hatred, it's kind of that relationship aspect of it. Same as like adultery, right? The act of adultery isn't necessarily what Jesus defines as adultery. He defines it as lust, as spending all of your time, effort, whatever, with someone who is not your spouse. We just kind of talked about how he, pretty concisely, right? If you read the Sermon on the Mount, just a side note, right? Best sermon ever. Takes about 8 minutes to read. That's all I'm saying, right? But pretty concisely reinterprets the foundation of the law. And we kind of focused on that. The last thing we talked about, which though I think was the most interesting, which it's not on the PowerPoint because we're awesome when we go off script, it's just kind of looking at how similar or dissimilar the old law and the new law is, right? We tend to think about, you have the New Testament, right? It's great, it's perfect, yay Jesus. And then you have the Old Testament, how burdensome it is, how terrible it is, and how like we would hate to live under it. But then we really talk about, like, obviously God is perfect. He didn't create a law that was flawed, right? I think a lot of times just our natural predisposition towards the old law is that it failed, right? It was wrong. Something was wrong with it. But we talk about it all the time, right? It's God made it. It's perfect. It's just that people kept messing up. And then we kind of focus on, well, God wants the relationship with his people. So the new law, just as perfect as the old law, but something that's more attainable for us. And I think we just kind of focused and talked on that. So moving forward with that, kind of staying on this reinterpretation side of it, we're going to go with what do we learn about the nature of God's commands from Jesus' reinterpretations. We kind of touched on this on Wednesday, but I want to kind of refocus on today since we have more people here. So like I said, kind of looking at, okay, it's not just thou shalt not murder, it's thou shalt not have hatred in your heart, right? It's not just thou shalt not commit adultery, it's thou shalt not lust and pine after someone who's not your spouse, right? Those ideas. What do we kind of learn about the nature of these commandments from them? Give you a couple minutes to talk about it with those around you, and then we'll come back and talk about it as a whole.
God's looking a lot deeper than just the action. It's your heart.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Disposition.
Actual
As I said the other night, some people have trouble with the word reinterpretation, as though he's making new, different things. But it's more like he expounded on it. You know, thou shalt not murder includes these other things. God was very concise. Jesus was more wordy.
Well, it's one way before.
Yeah.
You're not going to kill her.
Yeah.
Because it's such a narrow
Money. Even the anger thing. It's like this is whatever. It's ridiculous.
So I think what you're saying is Old Testament commands and also about murder. So as long as you didn't murder, sure, you may have hatred in your heart, but if you
Same thing.
right, if you restrain yourself and get to do the act of murder, then you would be guilty of
That can be just
that
extended.
commandment.
Whether you're ever with a real person or not, but I imagine spouse does not work.
Last time.
Give you about 30 more seconds.
Because Jesus says, you have heard it said, so that's what they used to do.
Yeah.
You shall not murder. It didn't say, thou shalt not murder. You know, by the way, thou shalt not hate. Thou shalt not be bitter.
Yeah.
It's a relationship.
The heart, thou shalt not murder. I don't see that.
Okay, so what do we learn about the nature of God's commands from kind of these reinterpretations of these Old Testament laws? What did we talk about?
So it's like kind of going from like an elementary understanding to like more of how you would understand rules in high school or college. Like God wants more than just a relationship with a child. He wants us to have a deep understanding relationship of like how He wants us to live as like a lifestyle versus hey, don't do this, don't do that.
Right, I love the school example because my wife, when she was teaching elementary school, right, she would have this long list of rules that her and her kids would make up. Like, hey, you should never touch another person, right? And they just go through the whole list. And then I also have to do that same thing every year, but I have one rule, and it's don't be a tool. Right? It's kind of like the reverse of it, but it's the same understanding of, it's almost Jesus, God here is like, hey, this is the true understanding, right? Before, when you look at the Old Testament, it's formulaic. There's that kind of this idea of boom, 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 and you just go, you follow it, and that equals you are a good person. Whereas here, it's a little bit like he's being more concise in explaining it, but it's also a little bit more vague, right? It's not just like it's this feeling, it's this heart, it's this relationship aspect, which is hard to quantify, right? Where the Old Testament, it's quantified, it's spelled out, it's boom, 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 which I think is weird to this because he's explaining it, right? And so in our minds, he's spelling it out for them. But for some reason, when I read this, I see it as more vague than it was before, which I think is kind of weird as I think about that. But yeah. What else?
We talked about that there's this definite approach of looking at, there's the law on stone and the law on the heart, and there's this idea of the actions versus emotions, and it's depth to it. I mean, that the murder, adultery, and oaths, you can look at those legalistically, and certainly murder has a different legal consequence than anger and adultery and lust, but the point was the heart, that what leads to murder, what leads to adultery, and that they all still are part of what God expects of us.
Yeah, right. And I think the go-to example for that to me when I think of Jews in general, like philanthropies, right? The idea of they have the law written on them at all times, right? Boom, they have it. And that's like, while not necessarily a bad idea, it's missing the point of what it means to have the word with you and written on your heart, right? And they just kind of miss that. And like here, yeah, this is as anti-legalistic as you can get is like, no, this is what it means in your heart. Not what it means outside, not what it means in the law. This is what it means to you as a person, as an individual. Right? So what does that tell us of God's command? If he's kind of making them in this more human-based perspective, or like heart-based perspective, well, what does that tell us about these commands? What's the point? What have I said is the point of the Bible like 5 billion times? Relationship, right? Relationship, right? Jesus is the fulfillment of this relationship, right? That's the whole point of Jesus, right? The fulfillment of the law. Well, the law is there so God can have a relationship with his people. So if Jesus is fulfilling it, that means when he comes back and talks about the laws, he's talking about this is really how you have a relationship with God, right? I wrote, it brings us closer to God's heart, right? And not these legalistic rules that kind of just help us fall in line. No, these actually bring us into that relationship, into that close heart-to-heart relationship that God wants. That's kind of how I see this. Anything else on this? Boom, I'm a genius. Moving on. So his relationship with the law, right? This idea of prioritizing heart and mercy over ritual, which pretty much the past 3 weeks is mainly what we focus on, right? We looked in Isaiah where God literally says he is weary of the ritualization of his religion, of his relationship, right? And now we get Jesus coming in and going, hey, it's all about what's in your heart. It's all about how you actually feel and how you show that to others, right? So Matthew 22:37-40, love God and neighbor, right? This is the core of the law. To me, and not to make it seem simple, this is equal to me writing "Don't be a tool" as the only rule in my classroom with high schoolers, right? Are there other rules in there? Are there other things you should be doing? 100%. But when it comes down to it and you have to make a decision, that's what you're basing it on, right? Is this something that someone who loves God and loves others and their neighbors would do, right? And I think Jesus here is just kind of narrowing that down. And then Matthew 23. All right, justice, mercy, and faithfulness are weightier matters of the law. Once again, Jesus is just here interacting with the law and kind of taking away that legalistic framework that they've been in for 1,000 years at this point. He goes, there's a time and place for that, right? He doesn't say these are the only matters, right? He doesn't say this is the only part of the law. He's just saying, hey, those places have their time and place, but the real core of this relationship, of this religion, are these things. Right? And this would be a drastic turn for the Jewish people kind of reading this, right? They've been told their whole lives, hey, if you follow this, you stay ritually clean, you do all these things, boom, you're safe, you're good. Right? This would have been drastic for them. So my question is, why do you think Jesus mentioned justice, mercy, and faithfulness as the weightier matters? And how does this affect how we practice our faith today? Okay, I'll give you a little bit to think about this. Probably a little bit more to talk about it, and then we'll come back.
Justice, we're talking about things leading up to breaking the commandments, which is used in the Old Testament. Or actually, we're trying to make a point, and that's what stress the new law. The new law stresses.
Look at this. Actually, it's very easy for us to read these words and talk about them.
Ritualistic sacrifices.
Not easy to look at.
Context of
Completion of these tasks. That was all.
It's in all this stuff. So much.
Which you intend in your heart. If you're honest with yourself,
It's so cool.
and trying to find that passage.
It kind of even goes back to the emotions. They were focused on the rituals. So do this, do that, do this, do that.
much more important than what you actually.
I like what you said. It reflects our God's original relationship with us. But it's not easy.
What is the statement that describes himself abundantly versus the other? Is that one?
Neglected those things.
We said
Yeah, because actually, people can be guilty of
here,
anger.
the Lord compassionate, merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abundantly with faithfulness, but by no means is he guilty of much. So we're going to mercy, justice, and God's
That's good.
self.
That's good.
Just as if the Old Testament is related something to the
So yeah, right, they got it. Original mistake. That's correct.
Kind of amazing when story of history. Leave it to man, and that's where you end up.
That's something
That's
more
right.
of. So that's what
About 20 more seconds.
Somebody else, you have to be looking at yourself.
I think it applies today when it's so easy to see on the just a checklist. Like, okay, went to church. Okay.
That's because justice makes sense.
No, Megan missed everything.
Oh, Megan.
Wally wasn't here, so
Yeah, so she didn't know where to go.
Kevin.
She was
Kevin abandoned us a week ago. So.
Clearly,
Yeah, I ran off all the old men.
prodigal, but again, this class.
Yeah.
Now I have no sense.
Now you're back to their
That's
microphones.
because Mark's a young
The
man.
last one too, isn't it? Oh, yeah. It's
great.
All right, let's take on this first half of the question first. So why do you think Jesus specifically mentions the three things, justice, mercy, and faithfulness, as being the weightier matters? Why?
Well, if you go to Exodus, I found 34.
Okay, using the Bible, cheer.
And God's
Jeez.
own description of himself. The Lord, compassionate and gracious, so merciful, slow to anger, abounding in loyal love, faithfulness, keeping loyal love for thousands, but by no means leaving the guilty unpunished, responding. So God's own self-description is justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And so if we're following him, we have to be him.
Yeah, right. And
So
you guys will get sick of it in the next 30 minutes, but it's the last class and one hammer at home. Right? God wants us to be like him, in a relationship with him. Right? It just makes sense that his laws are based on his heart. Right? You want a relationship with someone who has the same values as you. That's just common sense. That's how we work. Right? We're made in God's image. That's how he works. Right? And that's clear. Yeah.
I think that those are weightier because that's probably what, as human nature, that's what we have problems with.
Mm-hmm.
That's our, if we get that, if we cling to that, strive for that, everything else becomes easier.
Yeah, right? And that's the flip side of it, right? This is who God is. This is who he wants. Yet as humans, we struggle with these things, right? I heard over here, I feel justice might be the easiest one of these, right? It's for most of us, it's clear, concise, it makes sense, right? You did something, there is a punishment, that kind of makes sense. But then when it's applied to us, we're like, I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense to me, right? And that's hard to do. Mercy, right? Mercy is really hard, right, to understand, right? When you're not tied to it, is mercy easy? Yeah, right? That kind of makes sense. But when you're wrapped up in it, is mercy easy? No, right? And then faithfulness, right? Faithfulness is the hardest one of them all, right? Because to be faithful means 100%, right? And we can't do that, right? That is what we struggle with the most. It's the weightier matters because we're bad at it, but that's who God describes himself as. And that's really hard to do. Anything else on that one before we go to the second part?
That's what makes relationships work.
Yes.
That they're sacrificial, and a person who is trying to check boxes and trying to count mint and dill and cumin, that does not make relationships work. It is all about, it's
Is that a saying that I just don't know?
Yeah, it's what Matthew 23.
That's what it says.
Okay. I was like,
It's a New Testament thing.
yeah, I don't know.
But no, that's what you trying to be a lawyer does not make a relationship work.
Yeah.
Giving and being reliable and merciful.
Right? And because my first reaction to that was justice isn't part of our relationships. But then, is there mercy without justice? There's no idea there of mercy if there's no justice side of it, right? If I do something dumb, Emily has every right to be upset, right? And to treat me a little less than she should, right? But I think justice is a part of human, and we don't necessarily think of that as being part of a relationship. No, we have to hold ourselves and each other accountable. And that's right. All God is right. We see God as this God of wrath in the Old Testament. It's no, He's holding up his end of the right. This is part of the relationship he has entered in, right? There's that expectation there. So yeah.
I feel obligated because Wally's not here, but we have examples in the Old Testament of God telling us that this is what's important.
Yeah.
So the Bible's telling us.
Right, I mean, and that was Andrew's point, right? He literally told us, this is who I am. It's kind of important, right? And right, we've seen multiple stories where justice, mercy, especially when you look at the prophets and they're calling out the people. It's like, where's your justice? Where's your mercy? Where's your actual faithfulness? It's not here.
So I don't care about your sacrifices. I'd rather you obey the law than sacrifice.
Right, it's the idea of the poor, the leaders were like, oh yeah, they're here, they're alive, right? They're whatever, but is that real mercy? Is that, no, right? And that's 100%. Okay, so moving on to that, how does that affect how we practice our faith today? What does this mean for us? Slightly harder question.
I think it's challenging.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy to talk about, but not so easy to live.
Yep.
You know.
Yeah, like I said, mercy, when it's another situation with other people, just forgive them. Like, just let it go. Like, what are we doing? But then when it's you, and it hurt you, that's a whole different ballgame, right? Faithfulness. It's easy for me to be here right now talking about God, being like, yeah, my faith is pretty strong. But on that random Thursday, I don't know, I woke up, I'm a little tired. Oh, my students are all acting up. Oh, right? And then it's very easy to just forget. Right? And so all these things are very hard to do. So how do we get better at it? How do you get better at anything?
Stay on target.
Staying on target, practice. Right? All those things are a part of it.
Read the Bible.
Reading the Bible, right? Reading the Bible is part of the practice to me. Right? But it's the coach that's involved in the practice. Right? And I think we get in our heads a lot of times of, and even though logically we know we don't have to be perfect, I think it's very easy for us to kind of get into this idea of, no, I need to be good at these things now. Right? Boom, I'm baptized. Boom, I shouldn't have an issue with these things. Like I said, logically we know that's not how we work. But I think it's very easy to get into this cycle of kind of beating ourselves up over it. And not that we should sin on purpose or just be okay with it, but there's also, it is something that needs practice. This is hard work, right? I'm relatively young now, but I'm sure there's a lot of old people who can say they're not the best at these things because it's not easy, right? And so it takes practice, it takes genuine interest in kind of fixing yourselves. Yeah?
Along with tying into the practice part, looking for the daily opportunities to practice them, right? Because I think sometimes we get caught up in the big moments of, oh, in this big moment I was harmed, and instead of, retaliating and acting up, I did such, or whatever. Those big moments may not come as often as the little day-to-day moments that you can just show mercy, you can just be faithful or have justice, whether you're at the grocery store or whether you're dealing with your kids or your family members. So I say along with the practice is looking for the small opportunities in the day-to-day walk with God.
Yeah, right. And I think of it from a sports perspective, maybe because we're just saying practice, right? If you lose a really big game and it's all your fault, right? If I think of someone in the NFL, they're 34, they just lost the Super Bowl, it's probably the easiest time for them to just say, hey, you know what, I'm done. Retire, and that's all they think about the rest of the time, right? But it's another thing for them to go like, no, I can do this better. I can keep coming back and keep trying to do better. That's the attitude we need to have. It's not, oh no, I messed up. How can I recover from this and just focus only on that mess up? Like I said, it's good to look back, right? It's good to use your formative events to kind of help yourself, but it's not a good thing to be focused on those things, right? Because then you miss every other opportunity that goes. I like the idea of looking for the opportunities to practice and kind of go through these things because it doesn't happen naturally.
It's a daily thing. I mean,
yeah.
It's not a tidy list. I think sometimes we look for the tidy list of rules that we can say we followed, but it actually happens daily, and it happens in complicated ways. And so that's why it has to come from a different place than the law checklist.
Yeah, which I think is funny because, like I said, when we think of the old law, we think of like, oh, wouldn't it be terrible to live under a checklist and you have to do all these things? But then the other part of the time is like, that would kind of be nice. But like, obviously we see it didn't really work out for them, but there's kind of an idea of like, oh man, if I had these 5 things, the boom, 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 I'm done, there's no interpretation about it, I can see it, I can do it, right? But as you said earlier, is that a true relationship? Right? If Emily gives me a list of things to do on a Saturday and I do the list, does that mean I love her? No. Right? Like there's kind of this idea of there's a legalistic side of it that just doesn't make sense. Right? It's a daily practice. It's not just something that we can just check off and say we're done. Right? And I think that's huge. Anything else with this? Good, because there's another question. So, how can we ensure that our relationship with God is rooted in love rather than mere rule following? We already talked about this because that's what I like about this class. You guys naturally went where I was going. So, right, this is the same question, same answers. Right, the idea of it takes practice. It takes daily focus on I want to do these things. Right, and once again, it's not I want to do these things and I'm going to be perfect at them. It might not even be I'm going to do all three things at once all the time, or I'm going to focus on those three things all the time, right? But it is a daily practice, right? We look at the Old Testament, the Bereans, right? They daily studied. That means to me they daily practiced these things and meditated on these things. Okay. So that's his relationship. Moving on to his conflict, perhaps, in the law. So specifically the Sabbath, right? This comes up a lot in Jesus' ministry. You guys can turn to Mark 2. It's also up there. And there's this idea of Jesus reclaiming the Sabbath as a gift, not a burden. So starting in verse 23. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." So I think this, even for me, is a clear break from my understanding of the Sabbath. Right? And I don't know if it's just because the Jewish tradition lives on, so I have this actual real-world example of what the Sabbath is. But to me, this is drastically different, right? When we think of the Sabbath, we think of restrictions, right? You can't turn on lights. You can't cook food. There's just a list of can'ts. And we see Jesus here being like, that's not what this was made for, right? Are you supposed to be studying and focusing and relying on God? For sure. But the Jews here have made it into this negative thing of, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. But like I said, he even said, David said, right? The Sabbath was made for man, not man for Sabbath. So my question is, why do you think Jesus emphasized that Sabbath was made for man, not man for Sabbath? What is he trying to get across? What is he trying to prove here? Think about it, talk about it, and then come back.
It's supposed to be a time of rest. Okay, no, I can't use this.
To me, thinking about it is, what these things were, the Sabbath keeping, all those rules were trying to help us both. We're trying to our hearts to serve God, and we just rebel against God. These starving men,
mother's
heart rebelling against God, and was trying to care for these men.
And he said, if your animal falls in a pit, you're not going to pull them out. But your daily work, your normal routine should be. You should do everything you can to study and worship and
If you think about any of the rules to follow,
whatever.
it should have been
Take it out. Like there shouldn't be any laws about it, and they somehow turned it into this. So maybe that's why this really wasn't some of the harder ones, like we're not charging interest or making sure you leave X amount for people in your fields, which is a little more You have to be very intentional about that. This was just
Following
kind
all
of
these commandments.
take a day of worship and relax. Somehow you've been corrupted that way.
The new law is very much related to that.
About 20 more seconds.
What opportunities to feel accomplish these tasks.
Never stop working.
People, yeah.
Okay, so why do we think Jesus emphasized this? What do you think his point is here?
They had the Pharisees had redefined the word work we talked about. No work on the Sabbath, and they took that to mean, picking an ear of corn. Is that really working?
Mm-hmm.
And it was made more for, on Sabbath you should rest from your normal 6-day-a-week routine.
Mm-hmm.
Cut back, worship God, spend your time. But there were still things that had to be done. Like we said, if you're a mother with little kids, you still had to take care of those kids.
Yeah. Right. The idea of rest is very powerful in the Bible, right? It's this idea of peace, which, like I said, you see the Jews here take this idea of rest. Like I said, they just pile on. And we've talked about them building hedges around the law. This goes along with that too, right? They made it to the point where it's now stressful to rest. There's no peace found in the Sabbath here, right? Now it's a list of rules, it's a list of laws that aren't necessarily tied to the old law. And I think he's saying here, hey, this is supposed to be a positive thing. This is supposed to be a time for you to focus on me and all that you have, right? Does that mean you shouldn't eat, right? If you need to eat? No, that doesn't make sense, right? People tend to be peaceful after they've eaten, right? There's that idea of you guys are just missing the basic principles of this. What else?
This is just an aside. Wally mentioned this the other day, being in Jerusalem on the Sabbath in the hotel. They set the elevators so that you don't have to hit the buttons. They just stop at every floor, up and down, all day. They go up and down. Because if you hit the button, then you're working.
Yeah. And it's it's just that, when we're talking about the legalism side of it, it's just it's just the point is being missed, right? It's okay, cool. You are devout to this idea, right? You're devout to God in this way, but as we've seen in the Old Testament, God just doesn't want pure devotion when it's not actually following the law, right? And then there's that idea of you've missed the boat.
But I think what he was trying to do, maybe with these Sabbath rules and all these rules, is he's trying to mold the heart, which is
100%.
to mold the heart to want to serve God. And so David wasn't doing this to rebel. He was doing it because he had starving men with him.
Yeah, exactly. And Jesus came because he had to die, but he also wanted to mold the hearts of man, right? And we see that in almost every single interaction we have with him. He's trying to mold the hearts and the minds of those around him to be closer to God, right? And we can see that here. Anything else?
I remember when we first talked about this with the quail and the manna, that we talked about how the Sabbath was to teach man how to trust God. And I think that gets lost when you get into legalism, where it's 100%. More just a rule that I have to follow, rather than I'm taking a day off and hoping God provides me the next day my daily bread. And I think that's one thing that gets lost that Jesus is trying to emphasize here, is that this was to help you trust me, not for you to just follow another rule.
Yeah. Not for you to make guidelines of rules so that you're good, right? Yeah, exactly. Taking away the trust out of that relationship.
A contemporary iteration of this is how some people, we can treat the worship service.
100%.
Where we turn it into the checklist of, why weren't you there, and we didn't go for this amount of time, and we only did 2 songs instead of the 4 like we should, and we make all these little check. Because I know man wasn't made for the assembly. The assembly was made for man, and we should be coming together and doing kind of the same thing they're doing on the Sabbath. But we have a tendency, we can also turn it into this burdensome doors. I just don't want to go because I feel bad afterward because I've been run down for an hour and a half and just checking boxes.
Yeah, right. And I think it's very easy to get into that mindset of, I heard the lesson, I sang a few songs,
well, I'll consider myself to be, because I went to the worship, so like,
Yeah, now I'm better than everyone else,
Yeah,
right?
there
And there's
you
the
go.
idea of, and I know you've all done it, right? You look around and you see someone's not singing, you're like, oh, someone doesn't love Jesus today, right? And it's like, which, who knows what's going on in that person's mind, heart, whatever. It's not for us to judge, right? There's that idea of like, hey, I just sang 3 songs, they only sang 2. I mean, right? It's obviously we would never say those things out loud, but those thoughts are definitely permeating. Maybe not as dumb as mine, but right, those thoughts are there of, hey, look, I did all this. Look at what I've done this week. And I think that the Jews are the same thing, and almost everything that we've seen them do is, hey, look what I've done. Look what I've been able to do, instead of trusting in the Lord and kind of that aspect of it. Okay. Anything else?
I think it's a good thing every once in a while to shake up the assembly.
Yes.
Do it in different orders, because Bill's an elder and he's heard complaints, like you said.
Yeah.
We messed up so and so today, or we didn't,
Yeah.
And let's have the sermon first and then the Lord's Supper.
Yeah.
Just whatever.
Right. It's almost like our Sabbath is the verse of doing things orderly, and we take that word orderly and we're like, that means it has to be the same. It has to be on time, right? We have to have a countdown because we have to start exactly right. And there's that idea of, we have to follow all these things that we've made up, right? It's just all made up. And we've talked about traditions and all those things. Yeah. There's no reason why we can't have the Lord's Supper at the end, or at the very beginning, or wherever you want, as long as it's on a Sunday.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. Yeah, or have a singing on Sunday morning. Yeah, along with the Lord's Supper, right? There's no actual biblical reason why we can't do that.
Maybe we could have our classes on Sunday night. I mean, that would be...
Yeah, or maybe no Sunday nights. Oh, crazy. Right? But yeah, there's all these ideas that, and once again, I know a lot of us logically know that it doesn't matter. But then when things are off, we go, that service today was a little weird. It was a little off, right? And then we go, how orderly was that? I think that definitely plays a part, for sure.
I just say this, I was just going to say, many times I've wondered what would it have been like to worship with a church in the New Testament in the first century. One of these house churches. For one thing, they probably went at 6 in the morning because
there's probably a lot less time because they didn't have time for things.
And then they had to go to work.
Yeah.
But it would have been really nice to participate and see what they did.
Yeah, right. Just from a historical perspective, leisure time wasn't a thing until like the late 1800s, early 1900s. So like the idea that they just had like, they have time on the weekend or in the evenings.
They didn't have a weekend.
No, they had to work to survive, and that kind of was it. Right. So yeah, it would be very interesting to see what it would be like. Okay.
Well, the first time we went to Laura's congregation in Louisville, they have a sermon first and the Lord's Supper, and then you go to classes.
Mm-hmm.
And that just, I didn't think it was wrong, but it just really seemed weird.
Yeah.
I've never been to another place that did it that order.
It's like Henderson in Tampa, right? That they have a whole Lord's Supper assembly. They all leave, go to classes, then come back, and they have what we would call a typical service, right? There's nothing scripturally wrong with that. We're just like, that's a little weird, right?
Different.
It's different, right? So yeah, I think here, like, Jesus is just like, you guys are missing the point. And I think, yeah, we can miss that point too a lot of times. So we got...
Oh, sorry.
Go. No, you haven't been here in a month, so say all you need to say.
All right. Stay my piece. Just in addition to like the rest piece in itself, it's just a gracious opportunity to remember, like, and that they have all these festivals that they do once yearly to remember specific things God has done. But I think it's cool that He chooses for them to remember His presence weekly, to like have them be, that is the thing that they remember every single week, not that He saved them and brought them out of Egypt every week. He wants them to remember His presence and His like ability to provide for them every week.
He wants them to spend time focusing on the relationship that they have.
Yeah, which is like the whole,
right?
The whole point.
Right? That's so he's like, hey, I'm giving you this free time. Right? In their society, they had Saturdays off. Right? They had that last day of the week off. To just focus on their relationship and focus on the relationship with those around them. Right? Sabbath is also a time of family. Right? And that's purposeful too. 100%.
Especially around this time, the general broader view of the Jewish community and said they were slovenly because they were doing nothing for a day, and the rest
Yeah.
of the world was looking at them like, "What are you lazy, good for nothings doing?"
Yeah.
Which is kind of strange for us to think about it because we're like, "Yeah, a day off, great," but it was.
Yeah,
so
leisure time wasn't a thing in every other
got
society.
into the Pharisees in their heads like, "Oh, well, we shouldn't make this a fun, relaxing time because the world's looking at us bad.
Yeah.
So let's make it more super
Talk about
pious."
cultural exchange, right?
Yeah.
Definitely. The Egyptians weren't getting Saturdays off, right? There's that idea of, okay, maybe it needs to be some productive kind of time that people can see. Once again, it ties into why are the Pharisees doing these things? Well, it's clearly to be seen. And if you're just meditating on your relationship and kind of going about a somewhat normal day, are people really going to see you taking the Sabbath seriously? Probably not, right? And so we see them fall again to that. So my last question for you, you don't even have to share this one. This is just kind of for you. What is one big takeaway you've gotten from this class, right? So we've gone over basically the whole Old Testament, right? We started with the Garden of Eden. We started in that time where there wasn't a law, but people were still following God. We talked about the Exodus, Mount Sinai, the Judges, the Kings, the divided kingdoms, the prophets, and then all the way to Jesus. So this is not, we won't be sharing this one, but I just think it's important whenever you end something, really focus on what have you gotten out of it. And if it was nothing, then never come back. Okay? But just, like I said, I've enjoyed it. I've gotten a lot out of it, right? We always say you get more out of teaching than being taught, which is 100% true. But yeah. Thanks, guys. That's it.